I want to address the issue of compassion. Compassion has many faces. Some of them are fierce, some of them are wrathful. Some of them are tender, some of them are wise. A line that the Dalai Lama once said, he said, "Love and compassion are necessities. They are not luxuries. Without them, humanity cannot survive." So we can ask, what is compassion comprised of? And there are various facets, and there's referential and non-referential compassion. But first, compassion is comprised of that capacity to see clearly into the nature of suffering. It is that ability to really stand strong and to recognize also that I'm not separate from this suffering. But that is not enough, because compassion, which activates the motor cortex, means that we actually aspire to transform suffering. And if we're so blessed, we engage in activities that transform suffering. But compassion has another component, and that component is really essential. That component is that we cannot be attached to outcome. Now, I've worked with dying people for over 40 years. I had the privilege of working on death row and in maximum security for 6 years. And I realized so clearly in bringing my own life experience from working with dying people and training caregivers that any attachment to outcome would distort deeply my own capacity to be fully present to the whole catastrophe. And when I worked in the prison system, it was so clear to me that many of us in this room, and almost all of the men that I worked with on death row, the seeds of their own compassion had never been watered. That compassion is actually an inherent human quality. It is there within every human being. But the conditions for compassion to be activated, to be aroused, are particular conditions. And what is fascinating is that compassion has enemies. And those enemies are things like pity, moral outrage, fear. And we have a society, a world that is paralyzed by fear. And in that paralysis, of course, our capacity for compassion is also paralyzed. The very word terror is global. The very feeling of terror is global. So our work, in a certain way, is to address this imago, this kind of archetype that has pervaded the psyche of our entire globe. Now, we know from neuroscience that compassion has some very extraordinary qualities. For example, a person who is cultivating compassion, when they are in the presence of suffering, they feel that suffering a lot more than many other people do. However, they return to baseline a lot sooner. This is called resilience. Many of us think that compassion drains us, but I promise you, it is something that truly enlivens us. Another thing about compassion is that it really enhances what's called neural integration. It hooks up all parts of the brain. Another, which has been discovered by various researchers at Emory and at Davis and so on, is that compassion enhances our immune system. Hey, we live in a very noxious world. Most of us are shrinking in the face of psychosocial and physical poisons, of the toxins of our world. But compassion, the generation of compassion, actually mobilizes our immunity. If compassion is so good for us, I have a question. Why don't we train our children in compassion? If compassion is so good for us, why don't we train our healthcare providers in compassion so that they can do what they're supposed to do, which is to really transform suffering? And if compassion is so good for us, why don't we vote on compassion? Why don't we vote for people in our governments based on compassion so that we can have a more caring world? In Buddhism, we say it takes a strong back and a soft front. It takes tremendous strength of the back to uphold yourself in the midst of conditions. And that is the mental quality of equanimity. But it also takes a soft front, the capacity to really be open to the world as it is, to have an undefended heart. And the archetype of this in Buddhism is Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin. It's a female archetype. She who perceives the cries of suffering in the world. She stands with 10,000 arms. And in every hand, there is an instrument of liberation. And in the palm of every hand, there are eyes, and these are the eyes of wisdom. I say that for thousands of years, women have lived, exemplified, met in intimacy the archetype of Avalokiteshvara, of Kuan Yin, she who perceives the cries of suffering in the world. Women have manifested for thousands of years the strength arising from compassion in an unfiltered, unmediated way in perceiving suffering as it is. But the other side of the equation is you've got to come out of your cave. You have to come into the world like a Sangha did who was looking to realize Maitreya Buddha after 12 years. Sitting in the cave, he said, I'm out of here. He's going down the path. He sees something in the path. He looks, it's a dog. He drops to his knees. He sees that the dog has this big wound on his leg. The wound is just filled with maggots. He puts out his tongue in order to remove the maggots so as not to harm them. And at that moment, the dog transformed into the Buddha of loving kindness. I believe that women and girls today have to partner in a powerful way with men, with their fathers, with their sons, with their brothers, with the plumbers, the road builders, the caregivers, the doctors, the lawyers, with our president, and with all beings. The women in this room are lotuses in a sea of fire. May we actualize that capacity for women everywhere. Thank you.
I have a big heart, but there's a hole in my heart. I carry heaviness and sadness. Many of the women that work alongside me have big hearts too, but we have this hole in our hearts caused by all the suffering that we see. How do we move beyond that and be enlightened and have a happy heart like you? I admire you for that, and I want to learn from you how to take that sadness away.
Definitely, since
of course, I share when I hear your sort of actual
explanation.
Oh,
Listening to your to the accounts that you have given based upon your first person experience.
I also, because I feel
the pain.
I have a very strong feeling. But at the same time, they look only negative side. and demoralize is failure. I think since you establish your organization or your work, there must be some because of the positive result. There must be. I think without your organization, without such sort of the pay attention, I think more suffering. The suffering goes. So somebody, some organization now taking special care, then at least I think minimize. Isn't it? So that's the result. Should feel proud. 말해요. 다들 더더군 보호체 요새 먹고도 가다 강에 시부지에도 비슷한 거 껴버리 있어서 직접 투네 보호시를 해야
if you reflect upon what you have achieved since your organization was established, then there is certainly a lot of grounds to be proud of. And even if you are able to save one person under such difficult situation, one child, that in itself is a basis for tremendous sense of pride and achievement.
So otherwise, our mental emotion. Look only positive things, sometimes too much pride, and become unrealistic. And look, negative side, always negative side, demoralize, lost hope, that also they're unrealistic. So reality, they are positive, negative, and our whole life, whole century, go like that way. I think for us, Buddha, as a great master, Buddha came, I think has taught the rich philosophy, but failed to elimination of human misery. Right? And Jesus Christ come, then Muhammad, and all these great masters come. They made, I think, a tremendous sort of contribution. Relief for human suffering. But still suffering there. Will go. That's the reality. We must accept the reality.
This bodhisattva is known as Avalokiteshvara. One story about him goes like this. It is said that many centuries ago, Avalokiteshvara was a monk who for much of his life practiced meditation in a cave in the Himalayas. Then, at last, a moment came when he was on the very brink of enlightenment. He experienced tremendous joy and happiness, but at that instant, he heard a sound, a faint sound, which seemed to be coming from a very long way away. As he listened, he heard many voices. They were all crying out, wailing, weeping, grieving. The sound seemed to get louder and louder until, at last, he looked down. He looked down into the world, and he saw many people, millions of living beings suffering in so many ways, some dying untimely deaths by fire, shipwreck and execution, others suffering the loss of friends and family, illness, hunger, war. A tremendous compassion welled up in his heart, and the thought came to him, how can I leave these beings? How can I strive for enlightenment just for myself, when so many need my help and guidance? And so he made a great vow that he would work to help all beings become free from suffering. If I ever hesitate in my efforts, even for a second, may my body split into 1,000 pieces. Avalokiteshvara then entered into a deep meditation on compassion. For a long, long time he sat in meditation. At last he emerged and looked around. But everywhere he could see people continuing to suffer. I have spent all this time in meditation, but have I helped anyone to free themselves? He fell into despair and thought of giving up making an effort. Instantly, Avalokiteshvara's body shattered into 1,000 pieces, and he cried out in agony. But out of his great compassion, the shattered pieces of his body took a new shape. His shattered head became 11 heads, now able to look in every direction of space. From his shattered body appeared 1,000 arms which could reach out in all directions. Thus, Avalokiteshvara could work for the welfare of beings far more effectively than ever before. The image of Avalokiteshvara is a Buddhist expression in visual form of limitless compassion. There is also a sound associated with him, a mantra which represents compassion in sound. The mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum. It can be translated as the jewel in the lotus. Buddhists believe that we are like lotus buds. Inside each of us is the potential for gaining enlightenment. By practicing the Dharma, the lotus will unfold and the jewel of enlightenment will be revealed.
Om mani padme hum, mani padme hum, mani padme hum, mani padme hum, mani padme hum.